Joseph Plunkett, an Irish founding father. Joseph Plunkett was a man of many talents and backgrounds. He was well traveled, and he was educated in both Catholic and Protestant backgrounds, and this seemed to only strengthen his belief in the need for an independent and united Ireland. He was a poet, a linguist, a lifelong student, a farmer, a romantic, and more. He had become a central figure and a symbol of determination during the Easter Rising of 1916. He was ill for much of his life, but he was still a very motivated person who had much to contribute to the cause of his fellow rebels. Joseph was not too staunch in his own beliefs that he could not move. He and a lifelong friend, Thomas MacDonald, both adapted to many scenarios and consequences of rebelling against the crown during their short lives. They also seemed to grow and learn from each other's examples and influence. He wrote many poems, mostly dealing with his faith and with Christ, but his wife would also write several poems about her late young husband. It was Joseph's responsibility for planning the rising, and it was his plan they had followed. Although it is criticized by some in retrospect, the rising did not occur in the manner it was intended, and only Dublin rose when the time came. Most of the major cities across the island had plans in place to participate in the uprising. However, a false consolation of the uprising was relayed, and left only Dublin to rise. Plunkett was born November 21st, 1887, the son of a local papal count in one of Dublin's more affluent neighborhoods at 26 Upper Fitzwilliam Street. At a very young age, he would contract tuberculosis and thus began studying enormously, receiving his primary schooling in Lancashire, England. He would later return to Ireland to be educated by both the Protestant Jesuits at Belvedere College as well as the Catholic University School, both located in Dublin. He also would return to England to attend Stonyhurst College and the Officers Training Corps, where he would learn military strategy. Shortly after his graduation, he would travel Africa and the Mediterranean nations of Europe to ease the ongoing strain of his tuberculosis. Like many who are afflicted by crippling disease, Joseph resolved to sharpen and expand the abilities of his mind and ideology through study. Pictured is Belvedere College to the top left. To the top right, we see the Catholic University School, which has since been renamed several times, both located in Dublin. To the bottom left, we see Stonyhurst College in England. To the bottom right, we see a picture of the Officers Training Corps, which one all attended. Joseph hailed from a great Irish family of renown. The Plunketts were an old family that included many notable historical figures, including several earls, barons, knights, and even a saint. Saint Oliver Plunkett lived 1629 to 1681. Joseph's father, George Noble Plunkett, was a count, biographer, politician, and nationalist who must have impressed a very strong sense of being Irish on Joseph at a young age. His two brothers, George and Jack, were both involved in the Easter Rising and would later play major roles in the IRA. Little is discussed of his mother, other than her refusal to accept Joseph's illness was as serious as it really was. In addition to receiving a stout education at Catholic University School, Belvedere, Stonyhurst, and the Officers Training Corps, he certainly grew greatly in his worldview during his travels. Like his father before him, he took the opportunity of travel seriously and as a learning opportunity. And while witnessing the beginnings of World War I, he found new resolve in his nationalist tendencies. He never served in an organized military despite his training, more than likely due to his physical affliction. He did pursue his career as a poet and actor quite vigorously. He was a cultured individual, to say the least. Joseph spoke Irish, Gaelic, English, and German, and was avid about the preservation of the dying languages and cultures in Ireland. In addition to all this, he also owned and operated a farm, which he did use for agricultural production, but also to stage training operations for the uprising, as well as to be utilized as a landing zone for armed shipments. He was always seeking involvement with the cause and was instrumental in the logistical aspects of organizing such activities. He had formed several associations with many influential people in Ireland and was thus able to orchestrate many of the Irish Volunteers' activities in broad daylight. Joseph Plunkett did not live a very long life, but he was very active in his adult years. At age 28, he would be executed with the other leaders of the uprising. He did have one of the most famous romances in modern Irish history, with a woman named Grace Gifford. One of the founding members of the Irish Volunteers, Joseph was recognized as an indispensable individual early, both financially and intellectually. He would become one of the highest-ranking members of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, Commandant General. He would hold this rank and would be in command of the 1st Battalion in the uprising at the General Post Office in Dublin until he was incapacitated during the conflict and eventually taken into British custody after the surrender. Grace Gifford was an Irish cartoonist and artist. She lived a much longer life than Joseph, living to be age 67 and dying in the city she was born, Dublin, in 1955. Her and Joseph had a long romance, and both would write poems about each other. Only days before the execution of the leaders of the uprising, she learned of the imminent doom. She went to a local jeweler, purchasing a ring, and with the assistance of a priest and local military officials, she was given the opportunity to marry her beloved in the jail's chapel only hours before his sentence was to be carried out. She would never remarry. Shortly later, she was arrested with numerous others for their resistance affiliations and spent 3 months in prison in Kilmainham Gaol during the Irish Civil War circa 1923. When she was released, she would get an apartment near Trinity College and lived there the remainder of her days, even dying there. Grace was perhaps the only thing outside of education and furthering the rebel cause that Joseph spent any time pursuing before his early demise. She would become, in other respects, a very accomplished individual herself, and has her own fascinating tale with many wonderful written and illustrated works. Joseph's ideology was certainly well-rounded, as he was influenced and educated by both Protestants and Catholics, although he was perhaps more Catholic in his actions. This was partly due to his very strong sense of being Irish. One of the main characters that would shape his ideology was his lifelong friendship with Thomas MacDonald. Thomas, another leader of the 1916 uprising, participated in several other activities alongside Joseph, including jointly owning a theatre, working on poetry, and both being members of the Gaelic League. Thomas would also introduce Joseph to several other like-minded individuals and eventual leaders of the uprising, Patrick Pearse and Ian McNeill. These men would force each other to argue their positions and sometimes adapt them to better fit the context of the conflict they were facing. Although fundamentally against the Germans' form of socialism, Joseph nonetheless recognized that they needed weapons to fight a war, and that the enemy of his enemy was his friend. At the request of his compatriots, he was sent to negotiate the acquisition of arms from Germany. Only days before the uprising, Joseph would be hospitalized and have an operation on his neck due to his tuberculosis. Undeterred by his physical restraints, he was assisted dutifully by a young and then relatively unknown Republican by the name of Michael Collins. Collins would of course go on to become a very important character himself, serving as the chairman of the provisional government. Collins assisted Plunkett with the walking and other remedial tasks as they took over the General Post Office, and was commended for his energy and devotion in performance of his duties as aide-de-camp. Collins was undoubtedly influenced by many of the leaders of the IRB, but perhaps none more than Joseph Plunkett, his own passion and ideology clearly influenced by the examples set by the leaders. The fact that Joseph Plunkett was sent to negotiate the arms deal with Germany in the place of Roger Casement, who was never ordained as an official actor of the IRB, shows that the organization naturally pointed to Joseph as one of its natural leaders. Although we never learn if Caseman's efforts had any impact later in the conflicts, we do know that Joseph was successful in his negotiations and was successful in having a delivery of arms coincide with the uprising. Again, we see that one of Joseph's greatest strengths is not his wealth or education, but his effectiveness in accomplishing his goals. Several parallels can be drawn between Plunkett and the American revolutionary Benjamin Franklin. Both were men of many talents, languages, and skills, both born and educated with the respective aristocracies. Both were well-seasoned travelers, wealthy enough to have important assets to each's revolution that they wished to support, and each shared a deep sentiment for the common man who lacked their respective resources. They would both also serve as ambassadors to their provisional governments. Both these men would also be immortalized for the roles they played in the revolutions. Although Franklin was given the opportunity to live a much longer and perhaps more productive life than Joseph, I consider this very high praise for Mr. Plunkett. They both were prepared to die protecting their homes against the British, and were both academics in their own respects. Each of these men believed unwaveringly in republicanism. To me, Plunkett is the Irish Ben Franklin. It was truly leadership that the Irish people needed to survive the uprising and have any hope of achieving home rule. After eliminating many of the IRB's leaders, it took almost a century of conflict to succeed in that task. Examining the position of the Western world around the early 1900s, particularly the United States, with whom Ireland had a strong history, we can see that few people could find the motivation to participate in, let alone start a rebellion. The Dust Bowl caused famine, which the Irish were far too familiar with. The Great Recession caused wars. The Chinese Revolution was occurring on the other side of the world. As the world spiraled into World War I and the United States was quasi-allied with the British, who was the enemy of Ireland. So what was in their favor? What would motivate them to rebel when the whole world wouldn't pay attention? In the end, it would be nearly 3,500 men and women who would be taken into custody. They paid a price to capture the country's attention, but it was 15 men who were not given fair trials, that walked in front of a wall blindfolded, and gave Ireland what they needed to unite. They gave them a cause, a martyr, a symbol of what many felt in their hearts. Plunkett was wise and had obviously thought his actions through to their ultimate ends, and no doubt knew he would most likely face an early death. When he walked in front of the firing squad that day, in his second true view, it was himself that put him there. It was Joseph that caused his execution. May the 4th, 1916. He would die by his own hand, for the benefit of people he would never live to see or hear. Ask yourself, could you do it? Could you jeopardize your life, your family, and anyone you know for an idea, for something that may never take place, even if you do die? Luckily for the people of Ireland, as with many other nations in the world, there was a Joseph Plunkett to say yes. Well, that was heavy. Let's make it lighter. There's some happy little trees. Finn.